we've done a public meeting somewhere in Scotland every month, and I think it's part of our hallmark. It's hugely important. It's part of our dialogue with the Scottish people. We're public servants. We're therefore accountable to you, among other things. But it's not just about us wanting to be challenged, though we do want to be challenged, and please challenge us. This is also about making sure that we really understand the priorities and the issues right across Scotland that are relevant to land reform. So the format for this and all our public meetings actually is there will be a short presentation. Megan's going to do it tonight, and she will take us at a gallop through an overview of what we do. But we've done such a huge amount of work, she cannot possibly do more than just skate through it. And if you look on our website, you'll see the vast amount of stuff we've done. But she will do that in 15 minutes or so. And then we want to have a conversation and a discussion with you. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you think about what we've already done, what we might do in the future. Are we getting some things right? Are we getting some things wrong? Good to hear both of those. And if you've got questions, please provide us, ask us questions. There are two ways in which you can participate in that discussion. There is a hand function, which is a funny wee yellow hand that says raise hand somewhere on your screen. If you click on that, your hand will go up and should be able to see that you've done that, and I'll be able to invite you to contribute. If everyone puts their hand up at once, I'm afraid it's going to be difficult and I won't be able to involve you all, but I'll do my level best to bring everybody in. But the other way to participate is to use the chat function. There's a wee button there that says chat. If you click on that, you can then type things into the chat function and everyone can see it, so it's great. And people will be able to, so you can put comments and questions into the chat function, or you can add information if you like, which would be very helpful. I'm sure there are people in this call who are very knowledgeable. So please participate. This is a participative exercise. Of course, because this is not in a village hall, it's online. It's a mixed blessing. It allows people from all over the country to participate from their home. On the other hand, it's quite a difficult thing to manage. Some people like it, some people don't. We will do our best. We will also, I should emphasize, get back to doing real life public meetings as well, just as soon as circumstances allow. I think that's probably enough from me, Megan. I'm going to pass on to Megan now, and Megan is going to do her skate over things, and she's going to use some slides which you should be able to see. Thanks, Megan, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, so I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so just giving a quick introduction to who the Scottish Land Commission are and what is it we do. So we have been tasked with the job of driving forward land reform. But what is land reform, and well, why does it matter? So I like starting to talk about these things using real examples, and I've chosen a couple for this evening. The photo on the left is the Social Bite village in Granton outside Edinburgh, which I'm sure a number of you are familiar with. This is a project which is rehousing homeless people or people who are in temporary accommodation, and at the same time providing them with the skills and training and support to be able to get back on their feet and break the cycle of homelessness. The reason I'm mentioning it this evening is because this is an innovative project in its own right, but it's also innovative in terms of land reform because they're doing this all on a site which was previously vacant and derelict and a real blight on the local area. The photo at the bottom, the picture at the bottom is of the Winchborough development, which is one of the UK's largest placemaking development projects, about 12 miles west of Edinburgh, just outside the airport. And this is providing nearly 4,000 homes, but in a way which is very much focused on the creation of a community. So they're also thinking about infrastructure and transport, schools, jobs and enterprise, community space, and the development of green space in and around the housing project. And the reason it's innovative, again, from a land reform perspective, in addition to all of that, is because they have been working very closely with the residents who are already in the area to involve them and engage them and consult with them on the development of the site, how land is used in different parts, and what kind of community space and amenities are being provided. Now, these two projects, and I could have chosen any number from across Scotland, are really illustrative of just what kind of economic, social and environmental benefits come along as a result of land reform, why land reform is such an important part of the wider efforts that we need to make sure that places across Scotland are successful in our communities that people want to live and work in. And land reform for us is also an essential part of the broader policy packages and government objectives which are needed at the moment to respond to some much bigger challenges we're facing. The economic and recovery and renewal as following COVID, the climate emergency, our affordable housing crisis, the need to build resilient communities across Scotland. And it's because of all of this that we at the Land Commission feel so passionately about the importance of land reform and the benefits of what we're doing. So who are we? Well, the Land Commission was created as part of the 2016 Land Reform Act, and we were established by the Parliament in 2017. Our role is to advise the government on a programme of land reform which is relevant to urban as well as rural areas, and to provide advice which doesn't just think about the policy and legislative changes which are needed to do that, but the kind of behaviour, culture and practice-based changes which can be done more immediately on the ground in terms of progressing and changing the way that we think, use and manage land. We are 5 land commissioners. You have myself and David Adams joining you this evening, and we have 1 tenant farming commissioner whose job I'm going to discuss later on in the presentation. And then we are supported by a brilliant team of staff who normally are based out of our office in Inverness. So before I get into the detail of our work, I just want to speak about some changes in terms of Scottish Government policy which have set the direction of land reform for the foreseeable. And this is based around what's called the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. And this statement is a government policy which was finalised in 2017. It's another of the outcomes of the 2016 Act. And this policy statement is underpinning all of the Land Commission's work and the direction of land reform now. This statement is actually very unique in the world in terms of outlining the relationship between land reform and human rights. In particular, recognising that along with rights to land come responsibilities to your neighbours, to your local community, but also responsibilities to make sure that that land is delivering in terms of public good and the public interest. Prior to the 2016 Act, the protection of private property rights were often seen in Scotland as a means of sort of withholding or limiting the progress of land reform. But with that Act and with the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement in particular, Scotland's now moved in line with the rest of the world in recognising that human rights can be a springboard for progressing land reform, and that land reform likewise can help us meet our human rights obligations. So I'm going to spend just the next remaining minutes of the presentation giving a quick overview of our work. While I do this, I want you to remember that we are the Land Commission. We're not the Housing Commission or the Planning Commission nor the Transport nor the Access Rights Commission, and we're also independent from the Scottish Government. So we work on land reform in relation to the wider context, but we have to be focused and narrow on our approach and the things that we're working on. So we are about halfway through our second 3-year strategic plan, which runs from 2020 to 2023. This and all of the other documents relating to our work are available on our website. And as Andrew said, Sarah is currently very busy clicking on links and adding them to the chat function for you to be able to follow and directly access the work that I'm talking about. So this strategic plan has 3 priority areas: reforming land rights, responsible land ownership and use, and reforming land markets. And I'm going to speak about each one of these for a few minutes. So reforming land rights looks at who owns and uses land. And it recognises that the way in which we own, use and manage land has a significant impact on the distribution of wealth, resources and benefits across Scotland. So if we want to achieve wider government objectives such as tackling inequality or responding to the climate emergency, we do need to think about reforming that system of land rights. So there are various pieces of work within this work stream. One is around encouraging a more diverse pattern of land ownership. And at the moment, we're focusing particularly on the role that tax and fiscal reforms can play in this. The second is identifying new governance models to widen the range of people who benefit from land. within Scotland, we tend to focus on land ownership being either public or private, or by NGOs or by communities, whereas across many other countries in Europe, it's actually much more common to have a mixed governance models. And we've been learning a lot from what's happening in these countries and where there might be some successful models that we can apply and use here. And as I've already said, the changing dynamic in terms of the relationship between land reform and different types of human rights, particularly the land related rights, the economic, social and cultural rights, is going to continue to be a key part of the work that we do over the next few years. Another key area of work for us in the last couple of years has been looking at the impact of Scotland's highly unusually concentrated pattern of land ownership. And this was a piece of work that the government asked us to look at in 2018. So in the spring of 2019, we published the results of that research, which really focused in on the negative impacts that are being caused when land ownership is essentially a monopoly, and where you also have a monopoly over the control of decision making around that land and what kind of negative impacts that's causing on the ground. We also published a series of recommendations about what can be done, including the recommendation to introduce a test of the public interest for future large-scale land transfers. This is going to be as we saw from the Scottish National Party and Green Party draft agreement that was published last week, this issue and the proposal for a public interest test is going to be a core part of the land reform bill, the next land reform bill within this Parliament, which we understand is going to be coming forward in 2023. So we expect there to be quite a lot of focus on this area of our work in the next few months. Second of our work streams focuses on responsible land ownership and use, and this looks at whoever owns a piece of land, what can be done to make sure that they're owning and managing this land in a way which is more accountable and more responsible, both in terms of the local community as well as the wider public good. This work that we undertake within this work stream focuses on the implementation of the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, that human rights framework statement I mentioned a couple of slides before. And we're working with a range of different landowners and communities across Scotland to deliver and implement this statement. We've actually worked with over 150 landowners and communities in the last 12 months. We also publish protocols, tools and guidance to help with this. And between now and the end of the year, we're expanding this work to look at the role that public bodies, local authorities and the private sector can play in terms of mainstreaming the Land Rights Responsibility Statement within their own operations. And we're also going to be advising the government as this statement is up for review next year. The third of our work streams is around reforming land markets. Now, since we were first established back in 2017, one of the key issues we've been trying to better understand is why our land markets are not working effectively and efficiently, and what can be done to address this. And what I mean by this is, why is it that Scotland's land markets are, on the one hand, leaving vast areas of land across Scotland in a vacant and derelict state, which are having a blighting effect on the local community, but on the other hand, in some areas of Scotland, we desperately need land to be made available for affordable housing. So this problem of vacant and derelict land has been a core part of our work since we began operations. There are more than 11,000 hectares of land across Scotland which are vacant and derelict. In addition to this being a real blight on the local community, it's also a significant missed opportunity in how that land could be used more productively, both economically, but also in terms of social and environmental benefits. And this is a problem which disproportionately affects our most deprived communities. Back in 2018, we set up the Vacant and Derelict Task Force in conjunction with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and this brought national attention to the issue, and we published a series of recommendations about what different stakeholders can do to address the problem. That task force's work has now been completed, and the government is taking a number of our recommendations forward. Again, we saw this reflected in the draft SNP Green Party agreement last week. Some of the work we're continuing to take forward, and other work is being taken forward by local authorities. Another piece of work which we've focused on heavily for the last couple of years has been the challenge associated with why land is not being made easily available for affordable housing, and what role land availability plays in the overall affordability affordable housing problems across Scotland. Now, I'm very glad to have David Adams and David Stewart, who've both led on this work, join me, and they'll both be able to answer your detailed questions about this work. But in summary, we've just published last week the overall findings from that 2-year analysis. And this looked at what kind of reforms are needed to help bring land forward for housing in order to create homes that people want to live in at prices they can afford. And our overarching conclusion is that the current market-led model is simply not delivering affordable houses in this way. And instead, what we need to see is a much greater leading and leadership role being played by the private sector, by the public sector, sorry. So these conclusions were published alongside a series of recommendations to ministers, which have been designed to be supportive of the government's new £3.2 billion housing fund for affordable housing, as well as the new 100,000 affordable home target to be built by 2032. So the first of the recommendations is to create a new fund, which is supporting the network of place pioneers who can deliver housing on available public land as an initial step. The second recommendation is around empowering local authorities to designate regeneration partnership zones, which would be a means to focus on the assembly of land where land ownership is very fragmented as a means to help provide affordable housing in those areas. We've also made recommendations around the importance of land value capture as a mechanism to help local authorities access some of the increase in land value which results from planning permission or public investment in infrastructure in a particular area. Fourthly, we're recommending the creation of a new public land agency which can bring together stakeholders at within a much larger geographical focus and area to think about the provision of affordable housing and what role land and land availability needs to play within that. And then finally, we're recommending the introduction of a transparency obligation to require the disclosures of options agreements and other conditionalities which are being agreed in relation to particular sites. The work stream we have on reforming land markets also has work on tax and work on the impact on land values from the new net zero targets around the climate emergency, but we'll wait and discuss that in more detail at the questions section. And then finally, we have the work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, Dr. Bob McIntosh, whose role is to improve relations between tenant farmers and landowners. Bob and the team have been publishing a series of codes of practice and other guidance to help mend these relationships, and often responds to alleged breaches of the codes, as well as helping to facilitate mediation as a means of improving relations, particularly because if landowners and tenant farmers are waiting for legal action, then this can be very expensive and time consuming. And then we also do a lot of work around supporting new entrants, both in terms of land matching, as well as working with tenant farmers on succession planning. Finally, before I finish, I just want to let you know about a new campaign that we launched over the summer called My Land. And this is a hub of information and case studies and podcasts and films and loads of other information, which helps share information and lessons that can be learned about the way in which individuals and organisations have changed the land around them and as a result transformed communities. We're doing this because we want to get away from the idea that land reform is technical and really complex and really geeky, and actually demonstrate just how important and transformative and beneficial it can be on a whole range of different measures for local communities. So please join in the conversation and share your own experiences. So I'm going to hand back over to Andrew now. Thank you.
Megan, thank you very, very much indeed. And just to emphasise what she's just said, land reform can appear like a rather technical subject. Land reform impacts and has the potential to impact for the better on everybody's lives, urban and rural, which is why we're doing these public meetings, because we want to talk to people and understand that better. It is not, it should not be, and I hope will not be, a sort of inaccessible subject that boffins think about. But big thank you for that, Megan. I thought that was terrific. Sarah, also big thanks, lots of links going up. In case you're panicking about all these links, they're all links to our website. So you can go into the website and you'll find them there. Don't worry. And as I said, this is also being videoed. So if you really want to, you can watch it all again later on. Now, just to reiterate how we're going to do this, we want to have a conversation with you, a discussion, and we want to hear from you. If you want to challenge us. We're public servants. We're here to be challenged. I think it's very important that is part of these meetings, that you feel free to hold us to account if that's what you wish. I hope you'll have some positive feedback too, but I'm just giving you saying that now. Please, if you would like to speak, use the hand function, and I will do my best to manage that. And please, anything that goes wrong is my fault, not Sarah's. And if you don't want to speak, or you can't get in because I'm making a hash of it, please use the chat function, because everyone can see that, so you can get your thoughts in there. This is absolutely a discussion. By all means, ask questions. We'll endeavour to answer them. I'll take a number of points, and then I'll pause and I'll try and draw out themes, and then I'll come back to the panel and get their reflections. So we will go backwards and forwards, but I do want to hear from everybody here. If no one's got anything to say at the beginning, there's one point come up in the chat box already. I've made a note of that. And I also had an emailed question actually, so I can deal with that. However, we've got a hand up. Wonderful. Peter Brown, thank you very much indeed. That's always good if someone gets in. I'm not left there hanging here. So Peter, let's hear from you. Your thoughts, please.
Well, it's taking back, sorry, I'm getting feedback here, to a long time ago in Victorian times, where they introduced feud duty, and what you bought was the building, and the land was paid for by the feud duty. It separated the land cost from the building cost. And because there was no longer any pressure on land as people developed cars and moved further out of the cities, they took it away in the 70s. And everybody thought it was a marvelous idea. But actually, it was very sensible, because it separated the land from the property. And it meant you didn't have this current situation of deteriorating building standards because they try to make more economies because the land is so expensive.
Thank you. That's a really interesting thought. And it can't be all that long ago. I can remember it. There you go. Yeah, it was the 70s. Yeah, shocking, isn't it? Thanks very much, Peter. Right, I'm just going to keep going. Robin Kane, your thoughts, please.
Hiya.
Can I hear you?
I thought I'd unmute.
It's all right, you're about to choke to death or something. No, I can hear loud and clear, go for it.
Okay, so I don't know if it's much of a question or a comment or what, but I thought I'd just say, I live in high rises and I represent high rises. And when these high rises were built in Morden, there was a huge space of land set aside for them because it was part of the law, and you know they needed an X amount of green space per house. But because the law's changed, at least Edinburgh Council are encroaching on, going, oh, we want to build houses on it. So I'm wondering how I don't know how you guys affect that change, because it's not welcomed by at least my community. We don't have the infrastructure to support it, and also it's our garden, so I'm wondering.
Thank you. That's a really helpful one, and it's going to open up issues about asset transfer, community ownership, vacant and derelict land, a whole load of these things. So I will pick that up. I'm just going to hear, I think Harry Whitmore also. Harry, you had your hand up. Let's hear from you. I'm keen that we do hear from people, and we don't. I will bring the panel in, but I don't want you just to sit and listen to talking heads all evening from us. So Harry, over to you.
Oh yeah. I was just going to ask a question about asset transfers. Actually, I was wondering whether the Scottish Land Commission has a sort of relationship with the Edinburgh City Council about discussing and advocating for kind of asset transfers to advance things like community wealth building. Because a number of sites in the city have been, asset transfers have been increasing to some degree. I mean, take North Edinburgh Arts, and I was just wondering, what role the Scottish Land Commission plays in potentially advocating for that or facilitating that.
Great, thanks, Harry. We'll pick that up. I should make it clear, Megan tried to, but I'll make it clear again. We're a very small organisation with a national remit, so we don't have people local in Edinburgh. We do try to build relationships right across the board, but we have less than a dozen staff. So just to put a bit of context onto that, we haven't got loads of people rushing around talking to local authorities. We don't have that resource. Graham Forbes.
Good evening. I've posted this to the chat line, but I would like some clarification on the definition of vacant and derelict land and what powers local government has in forcing some action on this. And specifically, again, I'm like Robin, I'm from Edinburgh, and I know that there are quite a lot of areas of land where we get planning permission applied for, it's not back, and then it's the land is left for several years, then they come back again. And it appears to be that the land is left derelict until it becomes an eyesore, and then it's almost as if the residents or the council give up and take the next planning application to go ahead. And I wonder what powers that we can, or the powers that the council may have that that local people can force them to use to make the land more productive.
Thanks very much. I'm going to just take one more point, and then I am going to come to the panel. It's not only a question of what powers they have. We have recommended to government that local authorities have additional powers, and we'll talk to you about that in a wee second. Ian White had his hand up. Stuart, I'm going to hold on you if you don't mind, but Ian White, let's hear from Ian, and then I'm going to come to the panel to just get some thoughts from what we've heard so far. Ian.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, got you loud and clear, thanks.
Okay, you obviously the Land Commission has what it says is land, but what about land which is next to water and development of water sports, particularly facilities for when local authorities are selling land for housing, but like you had that in your presentation earlier on about Winchborough, nice new basin there, but it's all for higher leisure boats and that sort of thing. It's not for local sports clubs, and yet there's 4,500 new housing going in it.
Okay, and I'll try and deal with that. That's probably one for Scottish Canals, which I also chair. But more generally, the Land Commission is concerned with water, with fresh water, less so with marine issues, but with fresh water, yes. Now let's pause and let's hear, I think probably from the two Davids. We'll give Megan a rest if that's all right, Megan. Bumping the button if you want, but let's hear from the two Davids. Let's start with David Adams. David, quite a number of issues there. Why don't you just offer some general thoughts, and I may sort of draw out some things if I feel we're missing them.
So can I start with the question on what we mean by vacant and derelict land, and then just move on to the effectiveness of policy? There are some fairly tight definitions which are issued by the Scottish Government, and they are contained in all their guidance on the annual survey that local authorities are required to undertake and report to the Scottish Government. So we are talking primarily about land that was previously in use for some form of use or another. The distinction between vacant and derelict would be that land that is simply listed as vacant is considered that it can be developed without any form of rehabilitation. Land that is derelict is going to require some rehabilitation or treatment before it can be developed. Now, there are some limitations to the survey and the definition of what's included. So, for example, sites have to be of a certain size. They need to be of 0.1 hectares or above. Vacant land is only included if it's within a settlement. It's not sort of vacant land in the countryside, for example. But I think the answer is that there's some fairly consistent definitions that are published by the Scottish Government, and they've been used year in, year out to sort of count up the amount of vacant derelict land. Now, the issue around powers is, I guess, one of what local authorities can do short of acquiring the land themselves, because local authorities have long had powers to compulsory purchase land, Unfortunately, that's quite expensive. They're short of staff, they're short of resources to buy the land, and one often finds that nothing happens almost by default. So alongside compulsory purchase powers that local authorities have had, we have put a detailed proposal to the Scottish Government for the introduction of a new power, which we've called compulsory sales orders for vacant and derelict land. And the purpose of these orders is not that the local authority would buy the land themselves, but they would actually stop anyone sitting indefinitely on the land by forcing land to be sold if nothing had happened for a significant period of time. And there is a commitment from the government to introduce these powers. And our view is that they will make quite a difference, especially to places like Edinburgh, where there has been, over a long period of time, quite a number of key locations which have, nothing has been happening. They have sort of kept in a moribund state. And if you want to know why nothing's happening, you really have to go and ask the owner. And often the owner probably hasn't got a very good reason apart from simple speculation. So the key thing the Land Commission has done, alongside obviously a very detailed report on vacant derelict land, is to say local authority powers actually need to be reinforced to deal with those kind of sites. That proposal has been accepted in principle, and we now await legislation. I'll stop there, Andrew, and others might come in.
Sorry, this is my ineptitude with the technology. I'm now, I think, speaking again. David, thank you very much indeed. David, Stuart, just before I come to you, I just want to pick up some things from the chat. So first of all, can I welcome Paul McLennan? He's a MSP from just south of Edinburgh, but is also on an influential housing planning committee within the Scottish Parliament. A very warm welcome, Paul, and I've met Paul. So Paul is here, I'm sure, to listen as much as anything, but Paul, please contribute as well. Stuart Campbell, yes, I saw your hand up. I apologise, I will bring you in just as soon as I can. Learning from other countries, I'm just going to quickly deal with that before I come to you, David. It's at the guts of pretty much all our work that we go, we see no point in reinventing wheels, and we see no point in making the same mistakes as other people. So all our work streams, if you look at them, are nearly always presaged by a review of what happens elsewhere, particularly within Europe, but not just. We've also gone to North America and Australasia at times on specific issues. So please look at the website. You'll find all sorts of pieces of international comparison work on all sorts of themes, and it's a very important point. Thanks for making it, whoever it was. I'm afraid I didn't note that. Now, David Stewart, quite a lot of points there about houses, about high rises. You might want to touch on asset transfer, identikit houses, green belt, a whole load of issues. David is an absolute expert in all this sort of stuff. I'm not sure whether you're far too young to be an expert on food duty, but if you want to comment on that, you can too, David. Over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And yes, some great questions. I think maybe starting with the point on identikit housing, I think that is an issue, as is a lot of development of housing taking place in the green belt, and really a lot of the recommendations that Megan outlined from our recent review of land for housing, they're really about looking for public authorities to play a more self-confident role in setting out where housing should be, and also that it meets need and demand, rather than it simply being the most profitable type of housing that can be sold, but also to reuse brownfield land, so you don't have the problem of losing greenfield sites and losing agricultural land. So, and I think that's very important going forward, particularly with the climate change crisis and the need to encourage active travel. The question on green space and high rises, I obviously don't know the specific site, but green space is obviously very important. I think we've become really aware of that with COVID and lockdown. So it's obviously important that everyone has access to green space, but I think also that it's quality green space. And finally, the point on view duties and separating land and buildings, it's a really interesting idea, particularly as land prices rise. I know some work's been done by the Scottish Futures Trust, and I think Retties have also looked at developing a model that could do this, so that really people just pay for the housing cost and aren't caught up in land values. But I'm not a legal expert by any means, but I understand there's some challenges with Scots law.
David, thank you very much indeed. Some positive feedback on the compulsory sale order work in the chat. That was quite an early recommendation of ours. I know that government is taking that pretty seriously. I don't know where and if it will surface in law, but it's certainly been taken pretty seriously, and you can read about that on the website. I think it would be sensible to hear from some more of your thoughts now, and then we'll see where that goes. I would like, Megan, perhaps after we've heard from some folk, if we could pick up the asset transfer point, because I think particularly around this business of, I'm sorry, I've forgotten who it was. It was Robin, wasn't it, who raised the point about green space. Robin's point about green space, where councils own land or councils own assets, there are now some specific provisions about asset transfer. So we'll pick that up later, Megan, shall we? But actually, Megan, would you mind touching on that now? It just seems slightly rude. Robin raised it a wee while ago. Let's pick that up, and then I'll come to you, Stuart. I promise. Sorry, you're being very patient. Megan.
Yes, sure. I mean, frustratingly, this is not the first time we've had this question, and interestingly, it comes across from communities who are concerned about the reduction of green space across different parts of Scotland, but mainly in urban areas. So it's definitely an issue, and I think it goes without saying that COVID and the pandemic and lockdown and everything has just highlighted how important it is to have green space. In terms of the asset transfer process, yes, I mean, there is the mechanism, the asset transfer mechanism, which gives communities the right to start to initiate a conversation with local authorities about acquiring a piece of publicly owned land. There is we don't provide this kind of expertise, but organisations like Development Trust Association Scotland, Community Land Scotland, and then the asset transfer team within the Scottish Government all have a huge amount of resources which can help guide communities through that process and, make it all more simple than it initially seems to be, because a lot of the right to buy processes can be quite overwhelming for communities who are just starting out in this process. So I think that there's a lot that could be considered there, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a big building like the Belfield Church. It can be just small spaces which are really important for a local community, for garden space and community growing and allotments, rather than it being a significant asset. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on was Harry's question about asset transfer in relation to community wealth building, because going back to this draft agreement that was published last week, we're expecting to have a community wealth building bill in this Parliament, and that is expected to include some kind of provisions around public sector capital and revenue funding being targeted specifically for social, economic and environmental outcomes. So I think that provides, in addition to what can be done already through asset transfers and negotiations directly with local authorities, that community wealth building bill will start to provide additional requirements on local authorities, particularly to think about the community wealth which is generated from their assets and what they can do to help work with communities to deliver, to use their assets and land better for environmental, social and economic purposes. Thanks.
Megan, thank you. So Robin, and please email us in. We'll put an email address up at the end if you want us to try and get more information to you, and we will. We'll get you links and all that kind of stuff. But the asset transfer powers are enormously important. They're relatively recent. They're already transforming the relationship between communities and community empowerment and community activism and local authorities. So I think they're absolutely highly relevant to what I understood your work to be. Stuart, thank you for your patience, Stuart Campbell. And you did get your hand up earlier and I stupidly missed it. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
I represent a community council in southwest Edinburgh, where we have a land ownership problem, a public path associated with the Union Canal, but it's being maintained out of the goodness of their heart by the City of Edinburgh Council, but we couldn't find the owner. Searches on Registers of Scotland told us who used to own it, but not who owns it now, and the searches came to nothing. I see mention of a Registers of, soon new Registers of Scotland. Is that going to solve our problem?
Sure, thanks very much. I'll pick that up. Not the first time we've come across land that on the face of it nobody owns. There's actually a case study, I think, on the website, if you can find it, Sarah, about a woodland in Inverness where that was the case. Anybody else want to contribute at this point in time? I'm following the chat as well, or I'm trying to. So let's hear Martin Halls first and then Stuart McKenzie. Martin, please, welcome.
Thank you. I'm from a community in West Lothian. I know that we have a development trust and we've been trying to develop some affordable housing in our village. We found the biggest challenge has been engaging with the local authority, who just seems to have a different agenda to all the things that you've been talking about, Andrew. So, I think there's still quite a way to go in terms of education of local authorities, in terms of bringing them on board with this process.
Okay, thanks. And I'll pick up the point about the role of development trusts more generally in the discussion, and because increasingly, actually, development trusts are leading on affordable housing. It's one of the sort of really striking things of the last 6 months, I think. But point taken. To be fair to local authorities, that they often have an awful lot of conflicting challenges themselves. So I think it is a question of mutual understanding, developing mutual understanding. But there is no doubt that this is a fast-moving field, and people are catching up. We're all catching up, actually. I would hesitate to say that anyone's slower than anybody else. Stuart McKenzie, your thoughts, please, and then I'll come to Gina Temple.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'll just lower my hand. A quick question with regards to some terminology that Megan used on her presentation. We talked about something called the Public Land Agency. I wonder if you could just firstly tell me a little bit more about that. I'm wondering, is that going to be an agency that deals with the ownership of publicly held land? So, for instance, local council owned land, or is that an agency which is going to deal with ownership of all land? Second question was with regard to the ownership of land. Do we know, are there any plans for registration or re-registration of land ownership and beneficial land ownership? So who ultimately owns it behind the shell company, for instance? And then my third question is just with regards to the discussion paper that you guys prepared in February, which I think was submitted to Scottish Government. And I appreciate that it's entirely in their hands, but is there any view on what the next steps might be? What sort of concrete actions we might see on the back of that? Thank you, Andrew.
Stuart, you just have to forgive my ignorance. Can you just tell me which discussion paper? Because we published a lot of stuff in the last year. Which one are we specifically focusing on?
Yeah, it's the ones which is that you put in on February for, I'll give you the exact name. Legislative proposals to address the impact of Scotland's concentrated land fund.
Got you. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. I'm very glad you raised that. I was waiting for someone to raise it. Clearly it was in manifestos for the May election. It's in the Green SNP agreement just published, so it's a hugely important area, and we'll talk further about that in a minute. But I'd like to hear from one more before I go back to the panel. Gina Temple. I think you're muted still. Sorry, could you unmute?
Okay.
Got
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
The name Gina Temple's the secretary. I'm the chair of the Community Council, and it should read Patrick Kenny.
Patrick, welcome.
Thank you. I just want to ask a question about land ownership in Midlothian. We're trying to find land so we can build a secondary school, and we find it very difficult to find ownership and what the council own and what private developers own. Is there any way you guys could help us identify what the council own in our own area?
Brilliant, thanks very much indeed. So I'm going to now there's quite a number of thoughts, and let's just have a sort of reflection on that from the panel. So David Adams, could you possibly kick us off by just talking about the land register, the progress of the land register, the beneficial ownership point, who owns what, and also, if you can, any thought on where land appears to be ownerless? Could you offer us anything on that?
I think the difficulty is that we all think there's well-established public land registers in Scotland, and in fact the registration of land in Scotland goes back centuries. The difficulty is the original register seizings was not map-based, it's by description, and it's sometimes very difficult by written description to identify the particular piece of land. Now, in more recent decades, that has been is being replaced by the Land Register of Scotland, which is map-based and is searchable on a public basis, even if searchable at a fee. The difficulty is that it's not comprehensive. The government has an intention and plan over a period of time to make it comprehensive so that every piece of land will be on it. But in the meantime, there are gaps. There's a cost involved in actually searching it. So if, for example, you wanted to try and search through that mechanism for every piece of council land owned in Midlothian, it would actually be quite a difficult process. I should say that some local authorities would publish that information of their own accord, and often on the website. And I think best practice would be that a local authority should have no hesitation in making publicly available the land that it's owned. But clearly there's huge variation across Scotland, and it is a difficulty, and there are annoyingly small pieces of land that it's often very hard to find out who does own. There is procedures that the government has in place whereby the state can eventually claim ownership and then release it. I won't go to those in detail. And I just want to say a little bit about the question about the land agency, because I thought that was something we should comment on as well. So the proposal in the very recent proposal we've made, it's really a housing land agency or development land agency we have in mind, and it acquires land across the piece. It might be that it pulls in land from the public sector. It might be that it pulls in private sector land, but its role is to facilitate the transfer of land from those who already own it to those who are going to build on it. And our research has shown that that process of land being made available to, and this is quite aside from the planning status, but land being made available to those who want to build on it is quite hard, especially in rural Scotland, in regeneration areas, maybe less so in greenfield locations, but there's plenty of areas in Scotland where if you wanted to build a house, or if you were a small builder, you wanted to build a small number of houses, you simply cannot get your your hands on a piece of land, even before you started thinking of the planning position. So the land agency is a facilitator to ensure that the land market works a lot better and that land flows more smoothly from people who own it but maybe don't want to develop it to people who would want to develop and build. And this is especially housing at this stage, not necessarily all other uses in Scotland. I'll leave it there because others will come in, Andrew.
David, thanks very much. I'm going to turn to David Stewart now. Now, David Stewart is, among other things, our housing expert. And David, we've just published a really major 2-year piece of work on land for housing, which is well worth the read, although even I struggle to understand it and get my head around some of it. It's pretty complicated stuff. But Naomi has put up in the chat, I think very articulately, this problem. It's not just about can we have more houses, it's can we have the places and the kind of houses and the context that actually we want. And that seems to me to be central to this. So David Stewart, could you offer, just without going into the huge technical detail that your report does, could you offer some thoughts in this area? And could you just pick up as part of that any thoughts on if those who follow Twitter will see it. I mean, more and more development trusts saying, look, we're fed up with this. We're just going to crack on and try and do this ourselves. Thoughts from you, David, on that?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I thought it was a really excellent question that really encapsulates a big issue that I think bothers a lot of people across Scotland. There's really a couple of things I would suggest from the report to the 5 recommendations that would look to address this issue. And one was around better enabling the public to capture what we call land value capture. And that's really what happens where the value of a piece of land goes from what it would be, say, for farming use to a much, much higher value when it receives planning permission for housing. And we've suggested a number of ways that actually public authorities and communities could better capture some of that value to actually ensure that the facilities that are needed are put in place. For example, quality green space, access to parks. And one of the pieces of research we did in the course of the review looked at how European countries do that, specifically the Netherlands and Germany. So we drew on that in our recommendations. Another recommendation that I think is relevant here is at the moment, often developers can have options to buy land and no one really quite knows where that is or where proposals for future developments will spring up. So we've proposed that there should be an obligation on landowners and developers to publish where these options agreements are and also the value of the land. And that's really just to bring clarity around who owns land that might be developed for housing. So I hope that that's helpful, but really I think the need here is to allow the public sector to plan places more, take the value out of the land that's needed to provide these community facilities before the rest is passed on to the landowner.
Thanks, David. And do you want to offer any thoughts on this business of development trusts? I mean, it's a big ask of a development trust to raise the money to build affordable housing. On the other hand, development trust gives you real control in a way that almost no other way does. Do you want to offer any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah. Just very briefly. I mean, I've been tremendously impressed with the work and energy shown by a lot of development trusts that originally it may be more in rural areas where other bodies wouldn't develop housing, but more recently, I think we're starting to see it in urban areas such as Dumfries. It does seem to me it is a big ask, though, and what maybe needs to happen is it's right for these trusts to seek to meet the needs of their areas, but a possible role for the land agency, if it comes into existence, is I think to provide support and expertise to allow communities to meet their needs without people taking on an excessive amount of work and risks. I think that could be an important role to support community aspirations.
David, thanks very much. Now, Megan, I think it'd be helpful if you want to add anything on beneficial ownership and so on, that would be really helpful. But I would also like us to move on to the scale and concentration issue, where we've had a contribution. Sorry, I've got Sarah.
Sorry, Andrew. Stuart Campbell has raised a question as well. You won't be able to see it in the chat. He's asking, does the Commission have a view on land value taxation?
Great. Okay, thank you. And we've done work on that too, so we'll try and pick that one up as best we can. I'm sorry, I'm just going to write that down. So Megan, just on anything on the ownership and register stuff, but then what I'd like to do is just move the conversation on now to the scale and concentration work as well. So why don't you offer any quick thoughts on the register first, and then I'll deal with the concentration.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. No. So just to add to what David was saying about the efforts to complete the land register, one of the other outcomes of the 2016 Land Reform Act, which is the act that created the Land Commission and the Land Rights Responsibility Statement, was also a commitment to introduce what the Scottish Government has called a register of controlling interests, and that is a register that would sit under the Registers of Scotland, which is requires all landowners to put in information about those who ultimately control a piece of land. So essentially it's equivalent to beneficial ownership. This was the secondary regulation relating to this was passed in the autumn last year, and this new register comes into effect in April 2022. And I think off the top of my head, there's a 12 or 24 month period within which all landowners have to add this information before, that's the period with which the register has to be completed. And the purpose of this very much was to make sure that there is a single point of location where people can find out who ultimately owns different pieces of land across Scotland, regardless of whether it's an individual or a series of shell companies. And the purpose being that transparency, particularly for local communities, is essential in terms of land ownership, and is a key part of what all of Registers of Scotland and the Land Register needs to be about. And so ultimately, this information, the Register of Controlling Interest, will be accessible through ScotList, which is the Scottish Government's online register for any information to do with land, which the Land Register also connects with. So that will be the single sort of portal through which we'll all be able to access this information. So that was all I wanted to say on that, Andrew, and I'll hand back to you on scale and concentration.
Okay, so Megan, thank you. And I mean, the overall message on who owns what is that it's work in progress, but it is in progress. And so I think it's important to be clear. We can be pretty optimistic that we are going to have more and more information about who owns what. And the question we didn't answer, and I'm not going to go back to it now, but we didn't answer, was what happens if it appears that nobody owns. And there is a kind of land, a status where nobody owns. I think probably I might come. Can we come back? David, are you able to say something very, or Megan will, very briefly, Megan, is it some Queen's something or other? I can't remember the term. But.
Well, handily enough, we had a Commission lunchtime briefing on this exact topic about 4 months ago. So there is a body within the Scottish Government called, and I'm sorry for anyone for getting this name wrong, called the Queen and Lords Treasurer's Remembrancer, and their role is to deal with land which has no owner. And there's a set of procedures that they take responsibility for. And sometimes this is because people have died interstate and there's no will, but other times there simply is no owner, and they have a whole set of procedures for disposing of that land. They have a lot of activities now and are going to be much more connected with the Register of Controlling Interest and the Land Register in the future. So I think we'll expect to hear a bit more from them as they begin to scale up their work and be communicating a lot more about their work than they previously have done. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. So let's talk a bit about the scale and concentration. Let me start by reassuring Joanna, who's put something up in the chat. There's no question that I am aware of in Scotland about the state or government or anybody else taking all land into state control and ownership. I think that is simply not on the agenda in Scotland. But what is on the agenda in Scotland, and has been for a long time, is the fact that we have probably the most concentrated pattern of land ownership in Western Europe. And certainly around Edinburgh, you can see it in the west of Edinburgh. You know, very few people own most of the land immediately west, and to an extent east as well. We were asked to do some work on this. We've actually done a series of reports, which we did a lot of international comparison work first, then we produced various recommendations. I'm not going to rehearse all that. The upshot of it is that in the election manifestos and then in the Green SNP agreement last week, there is now a proposal for the land reform bill by 2023, and that bill will, among other things, include a public interest, a requirement for there to be a public interest test when a large and concentrated area of land changes hands in whatever way. Now, we don't know what the detail of that is at the moment, but the reason for that, and it's set out very clearly in our various reports, is it's not really about the size per se, it's about power, and it's about monopoly power. Most people would agree that we would not be comfortable if one person owned all the shops in a high street, because that creates a monopoly. And similarly, there is a concern that in some parts of Scotland, there are local monopolies over land. All the farms belong to one person. There are also islands that belong to one person, where not only the island, but the shop and the petrol station and the hotel belong to the same person. So you create these monopolies. So it is essentially, that work is about local monopolies and how do we deal with that in the public interest. Megan, do you want to add any thoughts on that? Otherwise, I think I'd like to go back to participants again, because they've probably heard enough from us. But do you want to add anything on that? No, okay. Let's go back to participants and hear further thoughts. Now, we've only got about 20 odd minutes now, but really value hearing from people. And please keep firing into the chat. You don't need to put your hand up if you want to contribute. Edward Tate, Ed, you've got your hand up. Over to you. Edward, I'm not sure if you're hearing me because you're on mute. No? Okay, let's look for other people who'd like to contribute. Peter Brown's going to contribute again. Oh, sorry, I tell you what, there is also this land value tax thing. I'll just say that I will come back to that, but I want to hear from other people first.
Oh.
Peter. Right, Peter, I can hear you, so I think over to you.
Right, yes, nothing to do with Fugees, you'll be glad to hear. We're talking about communities here, and I think there's a tendency to assume that a community is horizontal. And I'm conscious that there is a big blockage at the moment. 40% of Scots live in flatted accommodation. 40% of that is last century. And there is no mechanism. There is in other countries, you've mentioned other countries quite a lot, there is no mechanism in this country to establish the relationship legally between the owners to enable them to do public interest work. And I know the Scottish Government have got a procedure on this, they've got a committee looking at it, but it is incredibly frustrating for people that live in flatted accommodation to find they cannot, for example, put solar panels on the roof because there is no legal vehicle to allow them to do it. Is this something that, can we not regard the occupiers of a specific tenement or flatted accommodation as being members of a community of place?
Peter, thanks very much. So, yes, very aware that that is a topical issue. I've scribbled it down. Let's just hear from others, and then I'll come back to that. And land value tax. But anybody else want to offer thoughts? I'm not sure if Edward, are you there now?
Yes. Hi there. Yes,
Edward,
I'm here. Sorry,
let's hear from you.
My mute button. Yeah, I'd just like to make an observation, in that you know, I have a prominent cafe in the edge of Edinburgh, just at the beach towards Cramond, and basically, having grown up in the area, the whole area is surrounded by farmland. It was surrounded by 60 years ago. They put in a promenade, the City of Edinburgh Council, and it's surrounded by an area that was gifted to the nation of Scotland, Lauriston Castle. Now, I've done quite a lot of research into the surrounding area and the asset, which is Lauriston Castle itself, taking me across to America to a place called Ringling, the Ringling Museum. And one observation I would like to make and suggest to you all is that in Scotland at the moment, we have an asset of Lauriston Castle, which has been gifted to the nation in trust to the City of Edinburgh. It was gifted with a large amount of money, and they made a tit of it. They've made a right mess in that there's no money left in the pot, and the surrounding farmland and all the areas that were intended for parks and other things haven't happened. Now, in America, the Ringling Museum is built in Sarasota itself, founded by two Scots people. The whole area became a circus haven for the John Ringling and Mabel Ringling, who were a circus family who took over the Barnum and Bailey Circus. They donated in 1926, the same year as Lauriston Castle was gifted to the nation. They donated their house. It was used in the film Great Expectations. It's a great example of an amazing success story. The land now houses the world's greatest circus museum. It's the 6th largest visitor attraction in America for arts, and the surrounding land and area is held in great esteem by the trustees. It's right next to the water. It's a huge visitor attraction, and it shows basically what can be done if the community and trustees are reliable. The land is open to getting stuff done. In the most part, this is green land, which now has a very strong visitor attraction in numerous things. Whereas, unfortunately, in Scotland, we've got area which is farmland. It's been turned into a promenade, but for 50 years, the City of Edinburgh Council didn't do anything with the area. They put in resources to try and do things, but it was just left to rack and ruin. And now, a small individual like myself, we've basically turned around the whole thing. It's a huge visitor attraction, and still the City of Edinburgh Council, we own the building and things. The City of Edinburgh Council, instead of turning around to support initiatives like that, which are transformational for a whole frontage of the city, they pick, and surrounding land is surrounded with Japanese knotweed and a whole heap of things. There's not a can-do attitude here in Scotland to supporting things, and it's just an observation I want to make. Please look at the Ringling as an example of community transfer, things passed over to the University of Florida, and what they've done with assets. And that is, to me, that's a case study that needs to be dealt with, comparing it to Lauriston Castle and land and other things in a capital city. The Americans know how to do it. Us in Edinburgh and in Scotland made a right tit of it. Perfect. Thank you.
Edward, thanks very much indeed. I'm going to defend the Scottish people a little bit and say that we make a tit of things sometimes, and we do things really well sometimes, which is probably what all countries do. I'm not disagreeing with you. Next time I've got a moment, I'm going to cycle down and look at what you're talking about. But thank you for that. Any other? Various things in the chat, so we've got to thank you for those up. But anyone want to make any more comments?
Andrew, it's Paul here.
Paul, please, yes.
Yeah, I mean, a few things I think to take from me. I mean, yesterday the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee met for the first time, so it's literally a new committee. It's chaired by Ariane Burgess, the Green MSP, and there's 7 of us, I think, on it. So one of the things we were talking about was an extensive look and seeing what are the issues around about housing supply, and I think you've identified some. I think the discussions around about land value and catching the value, that's really important. I remember speaking to Retties about this a few years ago, and I think some of the issues were around about the contingent liability and where that kind of fell with, but I'm sure that could be something that could be looked at. Optioning land is a major issue, and having that register there, I think, is going to be vitally important. the west of Edinburgh is a prime example, and I stayed down in Dunbar, and Naomi's in the same, and will know what I'm talking about here. We've had land that's been optioned for over 30 years for private development. So that's been optioned for 30 years, bought over 30 years ago, and that happens quite a lot over East Lothian. So I think that's something we need to look at as well in that regard. NPF4, as you know, is coming out relatively soon. And you know, I've obviously met with yourself and we spoke. I've also met Link, which look at a lot of the obviously environmental issues. And I think, you know, that the work needs to encompass about what they're saying. You know, it's of course land value and housing is important, but it's a biodiversity, it's connectivity as well, which is really important. I think one of the things in your last speaker just spoken that was around about development trusts. I had a meeting with development trusts about a week, 10 days ago, and you often hear, have they got capacity to do it? And I was corrected and kind of said about Louisa McDowell, who some of you might know, and said it's not around about capacity, it's about confidence. So it's giving the confidence and having that support mechanism in place to make sure that if local communities want to do that, they should be able to do that and have enough support from the local authorities and from Scottish Government. And one other key thing, just talking about, for example, about tenements, and obviously when we had the chat yesterday, one of the things we were talking about was retrofitting. And it was Ken Gibb from Glasgow University was talking about it. The estimated cost of retrofitting properties in Scotland is £33 billion. So, you know, we're touching on, you know, it's a massive opportunity because, you know, we're looking around about how we can make sure that these are redeveloped. And of course, that then tackles the climate emergency. But there's big challenges in that regard as well. So again, you know, ownership and legislation for that's going to be really important. And just to close, Andrew, I mean, if anybody wants to drop me a note just on this, I know you and I have had a chat and the committee's very much at an early stage. If anybody wants to drop a note, it's Paul McLennan, East Lothian constituency. Please drop me a note and I can raise it at the committee. And I'm sure at some stage, Andrew, we'll have you into the committee talking about these issues. I'm certainly going to be proposing that, and I'm sure colleagues will support that. But yeah, this is really important. You know, we've had this antiquated system, if you like, for far, far too long. I mean, we need to move things on. We need to make sure that, you know, communities feel involved in this, and you know, that's not just getting them along for a consultation once every 10 years when the local development plan's put together. It's much more than that. Much more than that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's hugely important to us to have this engagement with parliamentarians. We do a lot of thinking. We publish a huge amount of information, but it's democratically elected, democratically accountable people who make decisions. So I'm most grateful to you for attending or coming to this meeting and contributing. Thank you, Paul, and for previous contact as well. There's quite a lot of things, and I know I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to pick up some things fast, and forgive me if they're a bit too fast. I want to deal with land value tax first. So I think we agree that land value tax is a really interesting area. We published some work very early on, which I think the link has already gone up to, but it's on the website, which told us that actually it's a very complicated thing, and countries that have tried it have had very mixed experiences. So it's not something to go diving into, but it's definitely serious. And in particular, it may well be having some immediate uses as a way of incentivizing the use of vacant and derelict land, for example. So we're clear that it is an interesting and potentially important tool, but not one that you can just adopt in some simplistic way. We will be publishing, land value tax is only one of many taxes, and tax in all sorts of forms is a very powerful tool to influence the way land is owned and used. We're going to publish a comprehensive report on tax in the autumn, so I'm not going to preempt that now, I think, but it's coming. We still need to do a bit more work there. Megan, I wonder if I could ask you, I'm just sort of trying to, forgive me if I chew this up a bit, but there's one or two issues about responsibilities, rights and responsibilities, conflict between different uses like grouse moors versus rewilding, which brings in rights and responsibilities statement, the protocols, maybe you could say a bit about, and also the land use partnerships. Could you just give us a very quick comment? I've only got about 10 minutes left.
Yes, happy to. So the land rights responsibility statement has 6 principles, and they are intended to guide landowners and local communities and anyone that manages land in the responsible way of managing that land, delivering for the landowner, but also delivering for the public good. And this is, although this is focused within this, originally came out of a human rights framework. It also really strongly emphasizes the importance of environmental stewardship. And as we now move into a government program around, which includes very clear targets for net zero, as well as responding to the broader climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis and the Just Transition Commission, I think we're basically going to see the framework for what that defines responsible land use for environmental, social and economic purposes become more clearly defined, and the revision of the Land Rights Responsibility Statement next year is an opportunity to explore this. The other thing I just wanted to respond to in the comments, which relates to this, was the question around the kind of response we get from landowners. As I said, the Good Practice Programme team have worked with 150 different landowners and local communities in the last 12 months. We work through membership organisations such as Scottish Land and Estates, as well as landowners individually on the ground. And in general, we get an incredibly positive response, and a very helpful response, and a very interested response in terms of what steps they need to take individually to implement the Land Rights Responsibility Statement, to think about their responsibilities to the local community, to better engage with the local community, to think about managing their land in a way which is more aligned with government targets. And the other thing just to mention is we have a flurry of new legislation coming in the next few years. One key thing we haven't yet mentioned is the Agriculture Bill, which is going to be the piece of legislation that replaces the European CAP and the subsidy framework. And we're very much likely to see that subsidy framework being based on needing to meet that triple of set of objectives around sustainable development. So the social, the environmental and the economic purposes. So that's going to be a really interesting process to watch in terms of helping to define what is responsible land ownership and use, and what does it mean for different landowners who are trying to achieve different purposes with their land. Thank you.
Megan, thank you. To close this in a few minutes, I'm going to ask the three panel for any final thoughts. So we'll be going there in a minute. Just let me pick up some quick points. Forgive me if I'm skating a bit here, but time is short. Have landowners engaged with this process? Yes, by and large they have actually. It would be nice to see more landowners at these public meetings, but I think outside, directly with us and privately, the engagement with landowners has been good. The engagement with the protocols has been good. And that doesn't mean to say there aren't some gaping holes in that. I mean, there are, and you would expect that because this is human beings we're talking about. My experience is that most landowners are essentially good people. They may not fully understand all of this. They may not fully understand what the Scottish people would like them to do. And so part of our job is bridging that gap. So I make that point. The second point I make is business, the question from Graham Forbes. Let's just recognise, sorry, it's in the chat, just to be clear, without going through the whole question or point, it's, should we move towards some more ideal situation where land is held in trusts by government or by communities? I just really want to add a tone of caution here. Let's just recognise that while the Scottish Government has significant powers under the devolution settlement, like many other countries in Europe, it's governed by various bits of human rights legislation, and the property and the right to enjoy your property is a human right under various treaties. So some of the more radical ideas that are sometimes thrown up are not realistic within that wider context. I just make that. I don't actually think they're necessary. I think we can do an awful lot. I'm a huge optimist. I think there's an awful lot we can do in Scotland to create a much better state of affairs without upsetting the entire apple cart, even if we would wish to. Before I ask the three panelists for their last thoughts, anybody want to offer their final sort of last thought from the audience? Anyone want to say something, or fire it into the chat if you prefer? Any thoughts? Positive, negative? Does this feel right? Wrong? Is it too much? Stuart Mackenzie, go for it, please.
Thank you. It's just very briefly, a quick word of thanks. It's been very informative. I've got a lot out of this, so thanks very much, guys.
Thanks, Stuart. I always feel that we've not, because this is such a big subject, that I always feel we haven't done it justice, but we do our best. Anybody else want to chuck in any thoughts? No. Okay, well, let's just hear some final thoughts from the panelists. We've covered a lot of ground. We haven't covered everything. Let's start with David Adams. David, any sort of overview thoughts on anything we've completely missed that should have been covered? Anything you like, go for it.
I think we've had a very, very wide range of discussion, and it really shows the breadth of topics that the Land Commission has done its best to engage with over the 3 or 4 years since we've been in business. I mean, I think what occurs to me, particularly from the housing, the planning, the urban side, is that we haven't really had a very strong land policy in Scotland. We've had planning policies, we've had environmental policies, and so on and so forth. And people question the effectiveness. Why is planning policy not, should we say, delivering what we hoped it would do? And to me, the reason is that until such time as planning policy is connected to some kind of urban land policy that deals with reforming land markets, about promoting land ownership in the public interest, not simply in the private interest, planning policy will continue to remain ineffective. So I think we can throw in, and we have thrown in that dimension into political discussion. Hopefully it will be picked up, and hopefully as Scotland moves forward, there will be increasing development of an urban land policy in Scotland and not just planning policy. Thanks, Andrew.
David, thanks very much indeed. And David Short, I'd be interested to hear your any sort of overview thoughts. You obviously have a very, particularly done a lot of work recently on housing, and that's been a very strong theme this evening. But any thoughts at all, David?
Thanks very much. I think I just briefly wanted to respond. I think there's been a couple of concerns raised on what can happen if you have a lot of public ownership and public intervention, and really to say, certainly on the proposals on the reform of the housing land market, what we proposed, it's not a public sector takeover. It's really about the public sector playing a fuller role, working with communities and enabling development, and really making sure that when houses are built, it's not just homes, but it's a community with all of the amenities that are required.
David, thanks. It's a really important point you've just made, because I think sometimes this is caricatured as the sort of state takeover. It's nothing of the sort. It's the state making sure that a market-driven economy delivers for everybody in an effective manner. Thank you. Megan, sorry to come to you last, but certainly not least, final thoughts and observations from Applecross to Edinburgh?
Well, I mean, I think what comes out to me more strongly each time we do these public webinars is that we need to be asking more from our land across Scotland, whether it's urban or rural land, because we need our land to be delivering the solutions to part of the solutions to the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, our ability to feed ourselves in the future, as well as where we live and the homes we live in and the communities we create. And I think that we're going to need to expect more from our land, not just in terms of kind of moving these vacant derelict sites back into productive use, but also expecting existing landowners to be delivering more around the public good. And we talk about this, we use the term improving the productivity of a piece of land. And we don't just mean that in sort of simple economic terms, we also mean it in terms of the social and the environmental benefits that can come from that land. And I think we have to move away from the idea of letting land just lay idle with no purpose and no benefit at all, because we simply can't afford to do that. And I think that what's the various different the new different pieces of legislation which are coming up over the next within this Parliament and the policy changes, like the revised Land Rights Responsibility Statement, provides some really interesting and exciting opportunities to provide a framework to enable us to do this, so that we really can do the best that we can as a country with the land asset that's been given to us. Thanks.
Megan, thank you. I said we would finish by 2030, 8:30, and it's bang on 8:30, so forgive me. I'm well aware that we haven't covered everything adequately. I'm well aware that some of you have got more to say. But I do think that's been enormously helpful from our point of view, and I hope it's been enormously helpful from your point of view. It's vital that we get this kind of input and feedback. And I'm sure Paul McLennan, as an elected MSP, would reflect that as well. There is a huge amount more on our website, which I hope is helpful about the work that we've been doing. Please read it. I mean, there just is a vast amount of resource there, and there's a lot more in the pipeline. I mentioned the tax report that's coming, but there's we will go on, and there's information on the website about what's coming and the work programme. There's an email address that's just gone up in the chat, info@landcommission.gov.scot, I think it is. Yes, it is. Well aware that in a public meeting, normally lots of people come up to me afterwards and tell me the things I didn't want to say in public, and you can't do that here. So please use the email, contact me. I will phone you if you want to have a private word. I'm perfectly willing to do that. Get good information sometimes from people who don't want to say things in public. So I'm perfectly willing to do that. Use that email address. Above all else, I think, please don't see land reform as something that the Land Commission does and you can now go away and do something else. Land reform is a continuous process, and I think if it's to be effective for Scotland, it's got to be a participative process. The Scottish people have got to really engage in it and ensure that their elected representatives do represent them. Paul's kindly just put his email up there, which is exactly what you want from your elected representatives. Thank you, Paul. We're not going away. We've got huge amounts of work to do still, and every time we hold one of these meetings, we learn of another thing. I'm going to go and think about food duty now. So we need your feedback and we need your challenge. So please keep giving it to us. Please follow what we're doing. Please use the email contact address. If you wish to speak to me or another commissioner privately, please tell us. We will do so. Please come to these public meetings and encourage others to come to these public meetings so that Scotland will get to a place where the Scottish people are at ease with the way in which their land is owned and used, which I don't think they are at the moment. But in the meantime, safe journey to your kitchen for a cocoa or whatever else it is. I'm sure it probably is a cocoa, but whatever else it is, safe journey to your kitchen.